Hello, I'm Sam. Welcome to Building God's People. Today, in the second chapter of 1 Corinthians, we look at what it means to be wise. It seems that true wisdom, God's wisdom, is hidden from the world, and the world can't understand it. But what is this wisdom, and who does God reveal it to? Well, let's find out as Dominic Steele speaks to us from 1 Corinthians chapter 2.
I want to begin today by putting a question to you. As an adult, who do you look to for advice? Who do you look to for instruction? What sorts of advice do you find yourself needing, and who do you look to for advice from? And conversely, what sort of subjects would you avoid getting advice from a particular person from? In that I know that there are some people that I would turn to for advice on this subject, but I wouldn't turn to for advice on parenting, or there'd be a whole range of subjects that I'd ask them, is this safe electrically, and not ask them about, or I might ask them, is the building structure safe? There's people that I'd turn to for different sorts of advice, and our house needed to be rewired electrically, and I asked Dean to come over and tell me whether or not I was being ripped off by the quote that I'd been given by somebody, and he's able to give me good advice and tell me no, that it was a fair quote that I'd been given. Or as a church, we have had lots of unsolicited advice this week. At the site inspection last week, at the council meeting on Tuesday night, all sorts of people with opinions on how we should conduct our affairs here. And last week at the site inspection, 5 or 6 people let me know in no uncertain terms what they thought of what we were doing, what we should be doing, and whose advice should a Christian listen to, and why, on what subjects. That's the issue we're kicking around today. And so we're back in Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, and last time the Apostle Paul was teaching the Corinthian church on the subject of wisdom. And he was saying that the Corinthian church had wrongly understood what wisdom was. Let me just get our context for a minute. Have a look with me in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and sentence 17. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, sentence 17, just to get the context. Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Now, just to refresh our memories, Paul has been arguing against a group of very clever public speakers who'd been travelling around the ancient world, and they'd come into Corinth, and these people had been giving the wise and clever rhetoric, and they'd been brilliant speakers. And Paul says, look, I'm not about wise, clever rhetoric. I'm about a message of a cross. I'm about a message of a man who was crucified. That's what saves people. Speaking of this, that is God's wise method of saving people. And he is delivering what the opponents would call a foolish message. But Paul says the way God saves is through this crucified Messiah. And I had a private conversation with one of the local councillors, and he said, why is this church doing so well? I said, look, I think there are spiritual reasons, and I think there are sociological reasons. And he listened very carefully as I talked him through the various sociological reasons, and I talked him through the spiritual reasons. And I don't think he got it. He got the sociological ones. I don't think he got the spiritual ones, because I was saying I think the reason that this church is doing well is because all the time we're on about a man who was crucified. That's what we talk about all the time. But you look at 18, the message of the cross, it's foolishness to those who are perishing. It just sounds crazy. But to those who are being saved, it's the power of God. We've got to remember that because we plan this Start the Ultimate Relationship weekend in September, and remember that the big goal of the weekend is training, and every event that we do, there'll be a series of measurable goals that we set ourselves as a group. And one of the measurable goals were the guests present. One of the measurable goals was the atmosphere conducive. One of the measurable goals was the gospel preached. And by that I'll mean, did we speak of the message of the cross? Did we speak about why he was crucified? Did we speak of the blood of Jesus? And then the final one was the gospel preached in such categories that people could understand it. And so these next 6-7 weeks, as we head up to the 16th of September, we want to be working at every point at equipping ourselves on the subject of speaking of the cross. And so in our community groups that we have meeting on the various weeknights, what I'm hoping we'll do as part of the next 6-7 weeks is practice speaking of the message of the cross to each other, and so that we're equipped for this time in September. That's part of the context. Second part of the context, chapter 2, sentence 1. I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or with superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power. Some Christian leaders have said from these sentences that the Apostle Paul was poor, dull, uninteresting speaker, and then they used these verses to defend their poor, dull, uninteresting speaking and say, Paul says, follow my example, he was dull and uninteresting, I'll follow it exactly and be dull and uninteresting. I think what Paul is arguing for here is not boringness. I think being boring is optional. What is not optional is speaking about the cross. In the book of Acts, chapter 14, sentence 13, I'll just give it to you, you can check it out later, but the pagans linked Paul with Hermes, the Greek god of communication, and I take it that's because Paul, the chief speaker, was a good speaker. In Acts chapter 17, verse 2, Luke writes that Paul spent hours reasoning, explaining, proving that Jesus was the Christ. I don't think what Paul is arguing here in these first 5 verses is that he's a useless public speaker. I think what Paul is arguing is when people hear him speak, his aim is not that people would be dazzled by the brilliance of his rhetoric. He doesn't want people to leave the room, leave the meetings, Paul, he was a fantastic speaker. He wants people to leave the room thinking, what a great saviour, because they've seen the cross clearly. And he wants this, so verse 5, your faith, the trust you have in Jesus, might not rest on men's wisdom, on some brilliant rhetoric, but on God's power, the power of God's Spirit. He didn't want people trusting the ability of his rhetoric. He wanted them trusting the power of the Spirit of God. Now we've hit our passage for the day. 3 contrasts to explore this morning. First contrast is between the wisdom of the age and the wisdom of God. The wisdom of this age. First, verse 6, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom. Chapter 1, Paul was attacking wisdom, attacking the wisdom of the world or the wisdom of the age. We do speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age, they're coming to nothing. And you think about the intellectual champions around, Niche or Roland Barthes or Stanley Fish or Richard Rorty or any of the people that the first-year communication students list out that they're doing their subjects on, and I look around here and there's lots of people who could list lots more names than that, but all those great philosophers, all the great wisdom of the age, and Niche says, God is dead. Somebody wrote that on the back of a toilet door at New College at the University of New South Wales. They wrote, God is dead, Niche. And somebody else came along and wrote, Niche is dead, God. Niche, come to nothing. Or you look over at Richard Dawkins in his Brief History of Time book, and that statement that he finished with, if we can put it all together, we will have achieved the ultimate human achievement. We will know the mind of God. And in the end, they're lofty, amazing, wonderful statements that are coming to nothing. I'll give you a pastoral problem, a practical problem, the sexual abuse of Aboriginal children in isolated communities. And the leaders of this age, the philosophers, the thinkers, the people that the Prime Minister turns to for advice, what do they say? I mean, rightly, it's a national disgrace. Rightly, it's a major emergency. Rightly, something needs to be done. But I heard one of the experts on the radio this week, and he's saying, what do we need to do to solve this problem? Education. Is education going to work to solve the problem? It won't work. The problem is not lack of knowledge. That's to imply that only ignorant people commit sexual abuse. The problem is human heart. There's a wisdom of this age around at the moment that every problem can be fixed by education, and that's not true. What is God's wisdom? God's wisdom is the message of the cross. God's wisdom is the message of the foolish message of the crucified Messiah. God's wisdom is that Jesus in his death fixes us from sin, and when we fix that relationship with him, then our other relationships can be sorted out, because I can go and ask you for forgiveness because I don't have to pretend that I'm perfect, because I know that I'm not, because I worship a God who has dealt with my imperfection. So 6, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature. Integral to the way I'm going the next few minutes is to understand that the word mature is referring to Christian. Paul's not speaking about mature Christians, immature Christians. That's not the paradigm he's working in. He's talking as if all Christians are mature, and the immature ones are the ones who don't know this wisdom yet, the ones who are not Christian, the one who is still following the wisdom of the age. I think there is a distinction in chapter 3 between immature and mature Christian, but I don't think that's the case here. How does it play out? Sentence 7. The wisdom, this message of the cross, is a wisdom that was 7, hidden. We speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that has been hidden. Down to 8. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it's written, no eye has seen, no ear heard, no mind conceived. They couldn't work out what this wisdom was. It's a hidden wisdom, a secret wisdom. People don't understand it. How can it be hidden? And yet Paul and the other New Testament writers also at the same time claim that the Old Testament predicted it. How can it be hidden and prophesied at the same time? I think this might help. Flick back 2 pages to Romans 16. Actually, on my Bible, it's the same page. Romans 16:25. Now to him who is able to establish you by my gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, the secret, hidden for long ages past, but now revealed and made known through the prophetic writings, by the command of the eternal God, so that all nations might believe and obey him. At one moment, the Apostle Paul is saying the message is hidden, long ages past hidden. And then he says in the same sentence, it's been revealed in the prophetic writings. You think, how does that work? I mean, you think about it from Paul's perspective. I mean, he grew up knowing the prophetic writings. He grew up knowing the Old Testament. He was a Jew. He was a well-informed Jew. But he didn't really grasp what they were saying until he met the resurrected Jesus on the Damascus Road. He'd read the Old Testament, but his eye hadn't seen. He'd read the Old Testament, but his ear hadn't heard. It was only when the Spirit crashed into his heart, when the Spirit overpowered his heart, that he grasped that Jesus is the Christ. And then he could see on the pages of the Old Testament, he could see it everywhere. Jesus says the Jews should have known. Luke 24, they were foolish and slow to understand, says Jesus. He opened their minds so they could understand the Scriptures. He poured the Spirit into their hearts at that point. I mean, it wasn't every Jew. Some had grasped more than others. You think about Simeon, Luke chapter 2, and Anna. There were two who were waiting at the temple for the consolation of Israel because they'd seen that God was going to do something, and so they were waiting for him to come and do it. Certainly, though, the local rulers didn't understand. If they had 1 Corinthians 2 sentence 8, none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. If they'd understood that what God was doing was saving the world by sending his Son to die, they wouldn't have been involved in being part of the opposition to that. But I don't think the rulers of today understand it either. Local government rulers, state government rulers, they don't understand God's secret wisdom. I mean, the councillors, the people opposing us, they have to admit we're doing good in the community, but they can't work out what's driving us. They can't work out this message of the crucified Messiah and how it would change hearts, because it just looks foolish from the outside. Secondly, on this wisdom of God, 7, the wisdom has been predestined before the beginning of time. We speak of God's secret wisdom, a wisdom that's been hidden, that God destined for our glory before time began. Whole of the Old Testament, whole plot of the Old Testament is God working in history to undo the effects of man's fall, to bring glory to his Son Jesus, so that Jesus might be the first of many brothers. He's breathtaking. It's amazing. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind conceived. Took a day off this week with the kids and spent it wandering around the Australian Museum, and amazing, some of the exhibits. Phenomenal, extraordinary. But this is bigger than the most amazing exhibit in the Australian Museum. Well, yesterday I spent the day reading Harry Potter 7. Amazing plot. Last line is, Harry woke up in his bedroom under the stairs. It had all been a dream. No, I was just kidding. But she's an amazing author, isn't she? I mean, her eye, her mind, the things she can conceive. I mean, she's very clever. Who would think that Hagrid would die on the first page? No, just kidding. But even the imagination of J.K. Rowling, it's beyond... He doesn't die on the first page. It's beyond comprehension that the God of the universe would conceive before the beginning of time, before creating the galaxies, that he would pick this planet, third one from the sun, and send his Son down there to die for the sins of the whole universe and thereby reconcile the universe to himself. No eye, no mind, no J.K. Rowling's with all her imagination could have come up with that. But 10, God has revealed it to us by his Spirit. We would never have dreamt it up, but God has revealed it. And the reason I can know it, this marvellous message, the reason we can understand it, is that God has revealed it. This is the primary work of the Spirit, to reveal this message of Jesus to us. What is the difference between somebody who is Christian, somebody who is not Christian, between somebody who is mature, somebody who is not mature? It's that God has poured his Spirit into the Christian. It's God has poured his Spirit into the heart of the mature. There's no other fundamental difference. As we start the Ultimate Relationship Mission in September, as we run Introducing God courses in our small groups after that, at every point we want to be teaching the cross. And at every point pleading with God to pour his Spirit into people's hearts so that we see that demonstration of the Spirit's power. That's the first contrast. Second one, it's the Spirit of God versus the spirit of the world. And Paul says of the Christian, they've not received the spirit of the world, but the Spirit of God. And he says of the person who isn't Christian, they've not received the Spirit of God, they've got the spirit of the world. What can we say about the Spirit of God? 10. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. Who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? I think the point here is that like knows like. I can only know me because my spirit knows me. Your spirit doesn't know me, but my spirit knows me. How can you know me? You can't get to know me by doing a scientific experiment on me. I suppose you could. You could discover that I've got say you decided, we'll put him to sleep. What can we work out about him? You could work out I've got a little bald patch between here and there, with little stitches, and really growing a moustache is out of the question. You could work that out about me. You could work out I've got some kind of spinal problem. You could work that out about me. But in terms of my, that's about it. You can't know my heart. You can't know my thoughts. Only my spirit knows that. Not even Kathy, my wife, knows all my thoughts. I try to tell her, but she says, Dominic, I haven't got time for this. There's lunches to be made. There's things to be done. I can't sit around all day listening to you. In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. That's what he's saying, isn't he? Next, verse 11. No one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. You can't get to know me by rational reflection. You can't get to know me by empirical observation. You can only get to know me by revelation. If I reveal me to you, and if it's the Spirit of God that reveals to us the thoughts of God. Verse 12, we've not received the spirit of this world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. It's God's Spirit that enables me to grasp that wonderful thing that he did in the cross of Christ, that free gift of Jesus. This is what we speak, 13, not in words taught us by human wisdom, the kind of things the human philosophers and leaders of this world think, but in words taught by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. The Spirit of God is so different to the world's spirit. God's Spirit is on about us understanding the mind of God. The world's spirit, it doesn't start with God, it starts with us and our wisdom. And people, from our point of view, we come up with all sorts of ideas of how to get right with God. And I'll do this, and I'll do that, and I'll do this, and I'll do that. And none of those things involve God deciding before time began to send his Son into the world to die in our place. The spirit of the world. Whichever way you choose to get to God, it's all the same, it's just preference. Charles Krauthammer in Time magazine told the story of going to hospital, checking in at the hospital counter, clerk of the hospital at the counter, asking him questions, name, address, rank, serial number, Medicare number. Mr. Krauthammer, what's your religious preference? That came up on the form. He said, I was tempted to say, I think Buddhism's the coolest, but I happen to be Jewish. And then he thought better of that and tried, I'm a Hebrew. Well, he thought of trying, I'm a Hebrew, ma'am. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land. But then he said, if I said that, I'd get sent to psychiatry, not to x-ray. He points out in the article, in ancient times, they used to say, who's your God? Then a generation ago, they said, what's your religion? And today they say, what's your religious preference? Or you fill in your profile on the internet, on Facebook. I like my coffee white with one, my wine red, my shirt starched, my sex straight, and put me down for Christianity. It's all just preference. Who cares? Because it's all different roads to that's the wisdom of the world. Whether it's yoga in daily life or Annandale Community Church. The spirit of the world says doesn't matter, just preference. Coffee, tea, red wine, white wine, starched, crumpled, straight, gay, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, doesn't matter. But the Spirit of God says, let me tell you, there was something that was hidden before time began. Let me tell you, you were unacceptable to God, but you were destined for glory before time began. Let me tell you how it happened. You'd never have conceived of this. You'd never have invented this. You'd never have thought of this. In my extraordinary wisdom, I sent my Son to die in your place and then poured out my Spirit so that you, though you were foolish, might grasp it. And so Paul says, look at people differently. See people in different categories, either spiritual or natural. Natural man, 14, the man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God. They're foolishness to him. He cannot understand them. They're spiritually discerned. Somebody talking to the counsellor this week. He cannot understand the message of the cross because it's spiritually discerned. Or someone, we're knocking on the door in Annandale and somebody says, that sounds stupid. They can't get it because it's spiritually discerned. You only get it if you've got the Spirit of God. But the man to whom God, the woman to whom God has given his Spirit, that person, 15, makes, this is key, this is very important, 15, that man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment. For who's known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Just going to work through those sentences slowly because it's very important and lots of people get this confused. Spiritual man is Christian. Natural man is non-Christian. Spiritual man, 15, makes judgments about all things. I think what Paul is meaning here is the spiritual man is able to make judgments about everything. The spiritual man is able to make judgments about the realm of the natural and the realm of the spiritual, whereas the natural man can only make judgments about the natural things. I don't think Paul is saying that the spiritual man will automatically be a brilliant engineer, automatically be a brilliant physicist, automatically be a brilliant chemist, automatically be a brilliant counsellor. All of that would be good for our egos, but I don't think that's what he's saying. But the Christian, the spiritual man, lives in the world of the natural and the world of the spiritual. So they're able to make comment on both those worlds. But the natural man is not able to make comment about the spiritual world. To ask a natural man, a man without the Spirit, to make comment on the spiritual world is a bit like asking a colourblind person to make comment on the beauty of a rainbow. Or it's about like asking a tone-deaf person to write a review about the great music makers, about Beethoven, Pavarotti or Britney. Maybe a tone-deaf person could make a comment about Britney. No, a spiritual person is not subject to the judgment of a natural person because the natural person cannot make a valid assessment of the spiritual. He himself is not subject to any man's judgment. Why? 16. Here's the answer. Because who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? Only the people who know the Lord's mind. Only the people who've been given the Spirit of God. Those spiritual people, they're the only ones who have the mind of Christ who are able to make the spiritual judgment. Council meeting this week. In lots of ways, the natural people are advising the spiritual people on what they should do. That speech from the precinct committee bloke. At one level, I've got to listen to the natural people. At one level, I've got to respect their view when the natural man tells me about brick colour. Listen. When the natural man tells me about shadow lines. Listen. I've learnt lots about architecture from the natural men the last few years. When they talk about their areas of natural expertise, listen. But when the bloke says redesign the thing from the ground up, what's the purpose? Why do you need a new building? What sort of building would it be? What things are you going to be doing in the building? What rooms are required to do what? Why does the building need to be a particular size? I mean, I read in one of the heritage reports, clearly written by a natural man, and he wrote about processional space. Sort of imagining Andrew Barry and Kath Semple and me processing around. I just thought, well, that's nice, that's interesting, but you've wasted your time and mine, and mate, you shouldn't be trying to make judgments in the spiritual arena because the Bible says it's outside your expertise. That's why the non-Christian journalists make such a hash when they come to write on... You know, every time you read a newspaper article that's written by a non-Christian about anything to do with spirituality, the natural man does not understand. When we got married, Kathy was there as well. A natural man wrote an account of our wedding. Natural man writing. Next stage was the formal proceedings, with the playing of Here Comes the Bride, and the stately walk down the aisle by the bridesmaids, with Kathy at the back in the arm of Uncle Bob. The minister serving was in a dinner suit rather than formal robes, and the form of the service was in other ways unusual. If there always has been a tendency to create your own form of service, I was unaware of it, but now it is commonplace and this was no exception. Frequent allusions to Dominic's well-known idiosyncratic nature were intrusive to some extent, as was the occasional tittering from the crowd, an audience more than a congregation. Nevertheless, if Dominic and Kathy do what they have vowed to do, this will have been a praiseworthy beginning. The preacher, one Alan Stewart, began amiably and wittily with a focus on Dominic at his expense, and shifted into a born-again promotion. While his remarks may have been familiar and comforting to many in the congregation, they were cult persuasion to others. There's a natural man's assessment. I thought Al's address was brilliant at our wedding. There's a few people who were there, here. But the wedding provides all sorts of difficulties for the young couple. And often, we're seeing a couple get married roughly once a month in this church at the moment. And it's often a great difficulty because we've got spiritual young adults who don't know how to make decisions together yet, and natural parents who are very experienced at making a decision. And there's conflict about what we'll actually do. And there's clashes because the natural one wants it this way and the spiritual one wants it that way. Well, we run a little late, so we won't take questions and comments now, but if we'll take them over morning tea if you want to raise them. Let me give you my 4 points of conclusion. First one, absolutely key to understanding 1 Corinthians 2 is that central to the ministry of the Spirit is the preaching of the cross. We preach Christ crucified. And the truly spiritual will be tied to the cross. If the Spirit of God is at work in you, you'll have accepted the cross of Christ on your behalf. You'll have understood the great gift of God. So the first point of application must be to ask you, are you a natural person or a spiritual person? You might say, look, quite honestly, Dominic, based on what you've said, well, not so much what you've said, but what the Apostle of God has written, I'm a natural person. Well, beg him to pour his Spirit into your life that you might grasp the Spirit of God. We'll beg in a moment on your behalf. Application point 2. We want to see the Spirit powerfully work in our Start the Ultimate Relationship weekend, in our Introducing God courses, so we keep speaking of the cross. Every talk, every presentation, one way or another, we must be pointing, leading to the cross. Pick the Bible passage where we can easily speak of the cross. For it is in the cross that the Spirit of God works. Application point 3, beware the Christian theologian who marginalises, sidelines the cross. And friends, they're all around. They're all around this district. You can hear sermons where they sound like they're saying all sorts of right and good and proper things, but you get to the end and you think, hang on, there was something missing, and you reflect on what was missing, and you reflect and you think, there was no blood. There was no blood in that talk. This week as a staff team, we looked at a Christian ministry's statement of belief. And we looked through the statement of belief carefully, and there was nothing about the Messiah dying in our place. Everything else it said was brilliant, but that was missing. I don't think the Spirit of God motivates that group, because it is the work of the Spirit of God to promote the message of the cross. And fourth point, don't look to the natural person for expertise in the matters of the Spirit. It's outside their paradigm.
It's amazing, isn't it? That to know God's wisdom means to believe that Jesus died for you and I. And it's the Holy Spirit that makes the difference between a natural person and a spiritual person. A spiritual person is someone who keeps the cross at the centre of all they do. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please email us to feedback@buildinggodspeople.com. Join us again next week as we continue our journey through 1 Corinthians.